Welcome, Reanimated fans. This is H.A. Conrad, here as always with my intrepid co-host, Stuart Tiffin. Hello, Stuart.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a hiatus. Sorry about that, folks. Life just sometimes gets in the way. But today we are going to be talking about episodes 1 and 2 of Season 7 of The Walking Dead. We haven't talked about this in a while. We were originally planning to talk about Tucker and Dale, but I totally had mixed it up with a couple of other creations that involve similar actors, and I was convinced there were zombies in this, but there were not. Just axe murderers and hillbillies.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I didn't realize you thought that.
Well, okay, so here's the deal, is that the one of the main actors in the show, Tyler Labine, is also in something called Reaper, and that is what I was thinking that this was. Also, perhaps in my adult horror show, I don't even know what fandom, I was mixing it up as well with Cabin in the Woods. So there you go.
Yeah. Well, it owes a lot to Cabin in the Woods. Honestly, I feel like I was the one mostly leaning away from reviewing this because I watched it. I was like, dude, I don't want to do it. And you're like, come on. And I'm like, no. My main beef is it's a movie with Alan. I don't know how to say his last name. Tudyk. I love that guy. I think he's amazing, but I felt like they didn't give him his wings room to flap, or whatever the analogy would be.
I thought this was a love letter to sort of the, Chainsaw Massacre type films, definitely, and just like an homage to all the silly tropes that happen in those kinds of films. So, I think we could have done it, but definitely no reanimated zombie things in it, but some really, really funny references. I still recommend it. But anyway, there's that. So instead, we will be talking about The Walking Dead, and I think that this is fitting given that we just and we have a couple of news articles about this, but we're there. It has just been renewed for another season, so that would be season 9. And some big stuff happened in this past season, right? Like in the mid-season. So,
Yeah.
So I don't want to.
I've already spoiled one of the events that happened on this podcast. So.
Well, I mean, I think if people haven't seen it, I mean, let's. I think it's fine to reveal it. Spoilers ahead for those of you who have not seen this.
We're talking spoilers for the current season 8.
Correct.
But we're not going to be talking about that. We're reviewing season 7. But sometimes it just can't help but slip out.
Well, I think the reason why it's so bright in my mind is, it is what it is. But also in season 7, as people may remember, the cliffhanger going into this season was who did they kill, and they killed two pretty significant characters. And in season 8, we have seen the last of our beloved Carl/Chandler Riggs. So that's kind of I have to admit, and I am not caught up, by the way, but I am almost caught up. And I feel like it's a little bit sad that they did it at this point for a couple of reasons. And one is that in the graphic novels, he has some really kind of cool scenes that I don't know if they're just going to replace it with somebody else, but he has some really cool storylines that happen later. And he was just... he was not being annoying. He was kind of grow out of his annoyingness. He had kind of become this full-fledged member that you were, I'll admit, I was begrudgingly starting to like. In any case, but maybe as a teenager, early 20s kind of actor, he was tired of tromping around in the wilds of Atlanta. But I digress. So we're going to be talking about season 7, first of all. And then we have a few news items, also a couple Walking Dead related ones. Do you want to dive into it, Stuart?
Well, sure. There were a couple of articles that kind of get into the nuts and bolts of ratings, which I find interesting. So last week, Deadline wrote up a piece on how the Walking Dead mid-season opener has, for its second time, beaten out the Winter Olympics closing ceremonies, which is pretty. I feel like I only ever watched the opening ceremonies at the Olympics. I never watched closing ceremonies, so I don't find that to be such a feat. Honestly,
I was about to say, I don't know that I felt like people were watching the Olympics as much this year at all. And, like, full disclosure, I don't have a television, so that may be part of it. But I feel like in the past, people would get together and watch certain events and things like that. And I don't know that I felt like there was as much excitement or hype about it this year. And this could just be because of the demographic I am hanging out with. But I watched the snowboarding events. I think I watched some of the curling events, but that was kind of it. And in the past, I've watched more than that, and I just wasn't feeling it this year. And so I don't know if other people felt that way. I don't know if you felt that way, but I'm not.
I've never watched the Olympics because I also don't have cable. So just does not happen.
And
although we went to a restaurant at one point, and it was on, and my son is like, it's like, what are they doing? That's ice dancing. I'm like, oh my God, we should have been watching the Olympics this whole time. It's like, it's good, wholesome TV. Should have found a way.
Yeah. But anyway, I mean, one thing that did come back, which I thought was pretty funny, and I totally forgot that this even existed. But do you remember as a kid there being like a skiing ballet event? Because apparently there was. Well, I highly recommend you Google this and look it up on YouTube, because I definitely remember this and thinking it was so weird as a kid watching this particular this particular thing in the Olympics in the 80s. Ski ballet. In any case, it doesn't. I think this is an odd way for them to talk about how The Walking Dead is doing in ratings, and the truth is that it's actually down.
Yeah, and they mentioned that later on. But I like these when they dig into these numbers, and they talk about how it was an uptick of 8%. From the winter finale, which was the lowest one ever, but or not, maybe not lowest one ever. We talked about it. I forget what the stat was, but they do also say that it is down several million. It's down almost 10 million from its high. I mean, that's insane. But the fact is, they have that much audience to lose.
True.
Like they are still one of the biggest TV shows on the TV world.
Oh, no, definitely. And there's no question about the fact that it was going to get renewed. I also think with some of the rescheduling of certain things that also attract similar audiences, like Game of Thrones isn't coming back for a while. I think that they will probably keep chugging along at a high clip. So it isn't to say...
They never competed, though. It was always like Walking Dead would end.
Right.
It'll be a week or two, and then that was great.
Right.
I love that.
I know. But anyway, I don't think that this is anything other than to say it still has a strong audience. It's just a little bit lower than usual. Next up, our wonderful friends at Forbes are talking about The Walking Dead finally getting a new zombie. And this is something that a lot of the fans have been talking about, which is, they've been wandering around in this world for a while. Wouldn't most of the walkers at this point just have had their clothes disintegrate or be off of them? I don't know if I completely agree with that, because it does take a really long time for clothes to deteriorate. I mean, look at the landfills and things like that. It's going to take a while. In fact, some of what I would say, and you and I have talked about this in a few past episodes, is how long were some of these walkers out there? Like, especially some of the super gnarly ones that are almost like in tatters. What were they doing in their clothes all of that time, But in any case, they are apparently bringing a full-on new zombie into The Walking Dead. Some people feel it's high time. I just think it's funny that they even are talking about it. but so that is kind of an interesting thing. And it was something you would see in some of, you have seen in zombie films in the past, but I don't know. Any thoughts on this, Stuart?
I think it's not really worth mentioning, I guess. They should just do it.
Right. It's just funny that they dedicated this whole thing to it, but it is Forbes after all.
Forbes dedicated this whole thing to it,
yes. And next up, you found it's another article about The Cured.
It's super paywall hidden, but the headline is really what my main takeaway. Mm-hmm. That the director... David Frayne, he took he was inspired by Nigel Farage and Donald Trump for the tone of The Cured, which I'll have to keep in the back of my mind when I watch this film eventually.
And that's coming up pretty soon, actually, which will be awesome. And then last, there is a new RPG game coming out, a show, based upon We're Alive. And so there's a small trailer and a description. Interesting. So it's such a that particular podcast, We're Alive, is so very popular, still very popular. People are still discovering it. And so I think it's interesting to see what they will do with this. And they've gotten some interesting players into this. So
I watched the first episode. It's based on it's not based on like its own engine, its own game mechanic, I guess. I'm not sure how you say that, but it's not like they made their own RPG. They're using one called Undead Outbreak, I think. And it's got a pretty interesting cast of it's Ivan Van Norman, who's like a regular DM on Geek and Sundry. I don't know if you ever watch any of their stuff.
Not really.
He's pretty good. He's really married to the subject matter in almost everything he does. But then they've got some cosplayers, YouTubers, and various and sundry other folks as part of this. One of the kids from the guild. He's not a kid anymore. He's a grown up, but he was the kid on the guild, which was Felicia Day's show, her breakout YouTube show. So the young man from that is one of the players / cast members on this on We're Alive Frontier. So I kind of enjoyed the first episode. You can see it on projectalpha.com. Alpha is Felicia Day's, I think it's just hers, but maybe it's a group of people, but attempt to monetize. It's a combination of Geek and Sundry and Nerdist TV or web shows are all hosted there. And speaking of Project Alpha and cool stuff happening there, I've told you before about Critical Role, which is the D&D show. So on Project Alpha 2 Thursdays ago, the guest on Critical Role was Kari Payton, which is actually extremely timely because he is a main figure in the second episode of that we're going to be recapping today. He plays King Ezekiel on Walking Dead. And he came on to Critical Role and played a human cleric called Shakasta, and was awesome. Brought all of that King Ezekiel splendor to the role. Honestly, it was a lot of fun to watch. And I guess he DMs for his kids, so he's not like a total newbie to Dungeons and Dragons, but he was a real natural, and it was fun. So I'm still really enjoying Critical Role. I mean, I've talked before about how D&D does have some like light undead and zombie content, but it's more of the magical than the terrifying post-apocalyptic variety.
Yep.
And that can be a nice break from the doom and gloom of our usual subject matter. So I'm enjoying that.
Right, but because we're not going to take a break, we're going to jump right into it.
Because I just can't give myself any chance, yeah.
No. There's a little bit of the magical, I would say, in one of these episodes, but not in the first one, certainly.
Kari Payton related, basically.
Yes. Yeah. So maybe it's just him that we need to focus on.
Him and Jerry, Jesus.
I know, right? But in any case, episode 1, the season... the season premiere for season 7, and this so I should lead into this by saying that the season finale of episode 6 of The Walking Dead was something that I was super angry about, just in the cliffhanger way that they left it, and in the way they led into it, and then the way they hyped it up over the whole summer, going into this premiere. I was no less angry when I first watched this. And they basically kept the cliffhanger going into like midway into the episode, right?
20 minutes in before you figure out who the second person. Yeah, that was a surprise.
It was a surprise, and it still made me even more angry because again, there's some things that I felt like you could have done with both of these characters, and if you were going to do this, I mean, let's and. So this was just the way that they treated this did not make me happy. So anyway,
this episode was a Nicotero Gimple combo. Their 1-2 punch called "The Day Will Come When You Won't Be" has 17 million U.S. viewers. So those are those big numbers. Those are those old school Walking Dead numbers. And I think a lot of that was due to all the hype around the last season finale. Frankly, just as much as people hated it, they still wanted to find out what happened. But they never get back to that level of viewers after this episode. It goes down by 4.5 million the very next episode. But yeah, that's just the logistics. We pick up like an hour in the future after the cliffhanger, because they want to cliff that hang a little bit longer. And like I said, 20 minutes in, we finally get back to like where we left the end of last season. And it's mostly just a giant psychological operation on Rick's brain. This whole episode,
and it's Negan doing his thing and just showing you how evil and sadistic Negan is, and just like it's. I mean, I kind of felt like watching this that look, the trend has been in The Walking Dead up until this point. While bad things happen, Rick's team typically, even if they are in danger or even if they are in dire straits, usually get out of it. Somebody usually rescues them, like Carol, for example. Or like maybe they might lose one person, but then the rest of the group does have some hope and gets out and goes on to do their own thing. They like very much push forward the idea that there is no hope here, and there is definitely a feeling of hopelessness within this particular within the group and within this episode. And it's like there's definitely the feeling that there's a new sheriff in town, and this is definitely, if you watch it back to back, which we did, episodes 1 and 2 in this case, it's to contrast the completely different makeup of the Hilltop folks with the Saviors. And in this case, I can imagine, I know why people stopped watching, because you took away two of definitely the fan favorites, though I think if it had been Daryl, there would have been a mutiny. But, or, so there's that as well. But I kind of felt like they pushed it too far with this in the way that they did it, though. I mean, I guess you have to show the downfall and the total surrender to the Saviors, or at least the visage of a surrender to the Saviors, to get where you're going in this season. But it still was a painful episode and felt, I don't know, it did not feel, it was just not a fun one to watch, at least for me.
He starts, like, as Rick starts off, he starts off looking shocked and saying, "I'm going to kill you," to Negan, which is the response we expect from Rick, right?
Of
like,
course.
never stop being, like, threatening people, basically. Never stop assuming that you're better than the person who's in front of you. And that has had different sorts of reactions, I guess. But he almost always manages to pull off his threat within the same episode, or, like, maybe the next one if they have to. But this one, they definitely strip all pretense away from that.
Yep.
Of course, if you're Negan in this scenario, if you can stomach the thought of being such a psycho for half a second, clearly Rick and Carl are the two people you're supposed to take care of in this scenario. Yep. As gross as that sounds.
Yeah, well, Rick, Carl, and Daryl.
I guess, yeah, I mean, I think the rest of them are all breakable.
Right.
Even Daryl.
Well, Daryl sort of, but Daryl has been the one, and he's aware of who Daryl is, because he's heard about it from his people. But Daryl and Rick are the only ones really showing the rebellion. And, when you're in a line, you've heard people say that they would stand up because it gives other people hope. That's often something you see within zombie films or anything about an occupying force or that kind of thing. So, I mean, Negan in his position knows that he needs to take away all hope that there will be a rebellion, and he needs to quash it in such a way that nobody is going to say anything against him. and not even like think about it. And he does this in a very like cruel but artful way, and a smart way if you're talking about strategy. I guess, like from my point of view, just in terms of how they played out this story, I think they did it fine. But it just, to me, it felt very long, and it was like, okay, we get the point. You know what I mean? Like, I think you drove it home, and drove it home in a way that was just a little bit ad nauseum. We get it. He's evil. Okay, let's go on with it. And I don't, like, in terms of the people that they kill, I think we can now reveal spoilers for those of you who have not seen this, but everybody's seen it at this point. It's Abraham and Glenn. And it would have, I feel like they could have given a little bit more to how people were like dealing with that. And they did give some at the end. But it's a very bleak episode, in a way that we have not seen. This is, I think this is probably the darkest episode in terms of the losses to the group. Glenn has been there from the beginning. You can't help but think about the first things that him and Rick did together in terms of their meeting and things like that. Abraham's connection with Sasha and Rosita and Eugene, and then, these are big losses. And even up till the end, Abraham's doing his version of rebellion. So it's and and then they do the heartbreaking thing with Glenn and Maggie, and it just is so brutal and so horrible. And I mean, God, and when they do it with Glenn, how they make him hang on there,
it's wrong.
It's bad, and I think that people were really angry about it. And the backlash after this episode, I mean, look, you know that they're going to kill people off. You know that actors want to go on to do other things, and that is totally valid. But the way that they handled this just felt like so terrible. And part of it is also, look, Glenn has been dying for seasons. Like, Glenn has almost died or thought to be dead for multiple
earlier,
times.
just in season 6, right? Yeah.
And I know that maybe some of what they did here was like, oh, you don't think we'll kill Glenn? We're going to give you not just no doubt that we have killed him, but we're going to make it like painful and long and horrible. And that said, the makeup effects in this were phenomenal. So.
Okay, that kind of goes without saying, right? I mean, well, that's not true. Sometimes they do those animatronic zombies that look terrible, but yeah, they are really good. The eyeball popping out. Yeah, so the original book, this encounter on the road has a much smaller cast, doesn't it? Like Rick's group.
Yeah, it's tiny.
I don't know if we've talked about this before, but I think there's only like 4 or 5 people for Negan to choose from when he decides to kill Glenn, because this is how Glenn dies in the book.
It
also,
is.
Spoiler alert. Like, Maggie's not there. Maggie's back at Alexandria because she's pregnant, and also Maggie has a much smaller role in the comic book than they've given Lauren Cohan. In my memory, anyway. I haven't actually read the books in a long time, but so they've definitely like trotted out all these extra characters and some the characters who aren't even in the books to be here. Is Father Gabriel even? No, he's back at Alexandria, right? He's not part of this lineup.
Yeah, he's not. Nope.
But it's and Morgan obviously and Carol aren't there either. It's just curious that they give you up to 10. Can't even remember how many of them there are between Eugene and dude, what's that one dude's name?
What the other dude?
Yeah, the dude who's with the other dude.
No, I know the scout
Ethan,
guy, the scout guy, right?
Yeah, like I see him in this lineup, and I'm just like, oh, okay, yeah, sure, kill him. Who cares? Nobody's gonna mind. He's been on the show for half a minute, and while he's okay, it's not the end of the world if they kill Johnny. Nope, it's not Johnny.
What is his name? Spencer?
Edward.
Spencer? No.
Aaron. It's Aaron.
Yes,
and he's
there you
with
go.
Eric. Eric and Aaron.
All right.
Sorry about that, guys.
Yeah.
You said Negan is Negan, but we really don't know him yet. You and I, this is the hard thing about us reviewing this show also years later.
I know.
Although we're catching up. Man, this is the last season of Walking Dead available on Netflix right now because 8 is still happening.
Uh-huh.
We're going to, before you know it, HA, we're going to be reviewing Walking Dead as it happens.
Oh, look at that.
It only took us 4 years. So but we don't know Negan yet as an audience, really. We he had a long monologue at the end of last season, but the time he spends with Rick is also quite telling. Mm-hmm. And the way he's manhandling Rick, these are scenes that I have a bit of an issue with. I'm like, okay, is he really like, what the hell? How do you pronounce this actor's name? It's like 3 names. Dean Morgan. What's the first part? Harry.
Jeffrey D. Morgan, you mean?
Jeffrey, thank you. The way he's like throwing Andrew Lincoln around when he's a little bit smaller, I think, in stature. They're both skinny guys. Not skinny, but like, toit. I don't know what the right word is. Tall and thin. And in the book, of course, I've said this before, that Negan's much bigger. He's like a
he's
football
massive.
player-sized dude.
Yeah, he's huge.
And Jeffrey Dean Morgan is not that. He's still menacing, mostly carried by his personality, but they try to make him physical in this episode, like throwing Rick around in and out of the camper. And I'm like, I don't feel like Rick would have this hard of a time finding his feet. Did you notice that?
Yeah, it almost felt like he was like some kind of a mime doing mime acting almost. Like it just was kind of strange. I mean, I guess you could, if you wanted to get into it, think that maybe he's absolutely in shock because of what he's just seen with Abraham and Glenn, and maybe that's how they wanted to play it. But I kind of feel like he knows he's in trouble, and his adrenaline would have kicked in at this point. And I don't think that Negan I don't think Negan would have been able to get the jump on him in the way that he does in this episode.
Oh, you mean in the camper?
Yeah, it just feels like Rick could have rallied and totally overcome him in this. At least that was my sense. It did feel a little bit like play acting to me.
Rick's day leading up to this, of course, it's been a really arduous time for the audience because that final episode was annoying, and this episode has been kind of annoying up to this point too. He hasn't been like sleep deprived. He hasn't been fighting. He's just been driving around all day. Like that was his day.
Yeah.
So he's got plenty of energy. He's got all of his fighting spirit, I would imagine, other than the fact that he just watched his 2 friends die. I'm like, yeah, I think Rick could totally take Negan in this scenario. Whether or not, he's got a gun. He's close enough, and he's got an axe.
Right. And also, the other thing that we've seen with Rick is that, yes, he did watch his 2 friends die, but typically that kind of thing, even though it might turn Rick into kind of psycho Rick, usually turns Rick into effective fighting killer Rick.
Like biting people's throats out, Rick.
Right. So I was expecting to see biting people's throats out, Rick, except for me, and I think you as well, I had read the comics, so I knew what this character was, and I knew what they were going to have to do with him. Yeah, I didn't feel like they fully pulled it off in the way that they choreographed this. I thought they were going to have Rick injured in some way to make it so that he wouldn't get the jump on Negan in this scenario, but that's not what happened. So anyway, they roll around in the camper for what seems like way too long of a time. There's the whole flashback scenes where we actually see what happens to Abraham and Glenn. And as I mentioned, It was drawn out and awful, and just really, it's like, how sadistic can you be? Like the twirling mustache thing that they do in this case, it was just like, well, we're going to get even more evil. And I just really was tired of it by the end of this episode. So
one thing that Negan does though is like express sympathy, or he's like, wow, this must be really tough for you. You can tell he's not being sincere, but this is like a nice, if I am gonna like say something nice about Negan and the way that they do him, is it's because Jeffrey Dean Morgan is so gosh darn charismatic. Mm-hmm. Like you can actually believe him. You can believe that he's like, wow, this probably sucks. You guys were together, or I can only imagine what this is like for you. You all thought you would grow old together. And it's pretty effective considering his actions are doing one thing and most of his words are also in that vein. But then every so often he'll be like, yeah, I know that this isn't easy. And you're like, oh, thanks, man. I appreciate that.
Well, I feel like he does not really acknowledge that it isn't easy. He just is a master manipulator, and even more so, like the governor compared to this is like, I don't know.
Oh God, the governor was amateur hour.
Amateur hour compared to this. And I just feel like he's saying this almost as a way to even make it hurt more. because he's that sadistic. And
Mm-hmm.
that was one of the things that I was like, oh God, please stop monologuing about how much this hurts. It's kind of like, whatever. I don't know. I was so tired of this episode and watching it a second time made me
Yeah.
angry all over again. So,
It super sucks. And then you've got to like end it with this really awkward like after there's the scene with Rick and Carl, and Rick definitely turns into a blubbery little blubber pants, as you should, being faced with the prospect of either cutting off your son's arm or having everybody killed, including your son. I mean, in a way, there's no question. There's nothing to think about. There is, obviously. It's all right, I'm oversimplifying it. I thought this was actually some pretty stellar acting by Andrew Lincoln.
and by Carl actually, and this is like the point where I feel like Carl's like, just do it, Dad. You know,
Yep.
like he knows what he has to do, and that's
Yeah.
kind of interesting. So you like that is. You actually see a lot of Rick in Carl in this, where Carl's just like, we have to make the hard choice here. So, you know.
But after the hard choice is made, and then the sentence is what do you call it? Put off,
Yeah,
deferred.
it's deferred.
The saviors leave. There are a lot of saviors as I continue to find out every episode.
Yeah.
There's always more saviors than you think.
And even in this episode, I don't know if I clocked this as well because of our wonderful game of counting the saviors.
I've stopped. I can't anymore.
I didn't count them, but what I will say is that the number of saviors that they show walking away sort of in the background at this, I feel like there were not that many throughout this episode until the very end when they're all walking away. Which is kind of annoying because you can understand how the group might be feeling totally outnumbered if you understood how many saviors were actually there. And if they were there, they didn't make it entirely clear that that's how many were there. So that was just kind of a funny thing.
I have so many issues with how the saviors work and how they have so many people, but after they all leave, Rick's group is left kind of all sitting in the dirt. There's some really awkward stuff going on with Maggie and Rick being like, let us help, and Sasha and Michonne. Yeah, it's just a super sad and awkward ending, and it's definitely puts you in a place where, I don't know, 4.5 million people were like, yeah, I'm done.
Yep.
I'm not coming back next week.
Yep.
And I don't know. I don't know if the showrunner figured out that formula, but the rest of this season is kind of a lot more of the first episode, in my opinion.
Agreed.
We haven't rewatched them, but I just remember this being a long slog of depressing.
Yes, it was. So,
But
but
that is very balanced out by the next episode, The Well.
right, and as I mentioned, this is a complete contradiction to the first episode. This is a breath of fresh air after watching that episode, which is probably why they did this. But it is also, it feels, because of how fantastical it is, it feels like a delusion. And I definitely feel like Carol's character in this is supposed to be us as the audience, kind of going through the hilltop community, and really the question is this is just batshit crazy, and how are you guys sustaining this? You know, like, you guys are living in like an absolute fantasy, and they are, and so I feel like that skepticism that she has is supposed to be the audience skepticism.
Yeah.
So, and you definitely feel that throughout this episode, but basically this picks up where, you know, she and Morgan have been, she's been shot multiple times, and then Morgan has actually taken care of her attacker.
Murdered him.
Yeah, but with a gun, which is definitely un-Morgan-like. And the Hilltop group comes and basically rescues them and brings them back. And she's you see some of what was going on with her. Like, she's absolutely delirious because of all of the wounds that she has suffered. She sees walkers as real people. before they finally like grab her and bring her back to Hilltop.
Oh yeah, that's scary when she's having those visions. It's
But
like you are super compromised if you're in a zombie apocalypse and you can't see zombies.
and I think she kind of knows that because then they kind of
Yeah.
float in and out, so there's that going on. And when she comes to, she's basically in what also must seem a bit like a fantasy world to her because it's she's in a clean bed. Morgan's there. There's no walkers going on. And even the color palette in this particular episode compared to the other, the contrast, there's so much light. There is none of the contrasty colors. And, I will say the first episode of this season feels so comic booky. It's really intense and saturated. And then you go into this world of Hilltop where everything's like kind of pastels and bright lights and sunshine and plants.
Acapella music.
Acapella music. And it even leads into this. It almost feels like a dream vision, which is what I think was intentional. So when Morgan brings her to, and he's not giving her too much information. He just says, "Oh, they took care of you, so I stayed around to help." And he brings her to their leader, and there's all this like he's very hesitant to tell her what actually is going on, and you soon see why. Because he very like quickly kind of mumbles that she's going to go see King Ezekiel, and she's like, "What are you talking about?" And I love Melissa McBride's her interpretation of Carol, because Carol is obviously a survivor and a chameleon, and we've seen Carol do this switcheroo before, where she goes from being the hard-bitten warrior, cynical person that just is not taking any crap from anybody, to basically pretending to be this docile, passive, very helpless housewife, which is kind of what she was before. And she goes in to meet Ezekiel, and she pulls on this act so fast, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. And yet it also feels like her reaction is the skepticism that you're describing. Mine is like, oh no, let's just embrace these guys. Especially Jerry, who's played by Cooper Andrews. Deuces, there's no way that these guys are secretly evil.
No.
I don't think she thinks that they're secretly evil. She thinks that they're just idiots and they're all going to die.
Well, look, they just had the experience with Alexandria, where basically all those people were very naive and they died for it. And Rick's group was there to try to basically show them how they needed to survive, and clearly was not successful. So I think she's coming into this not necessarily thinking that they're evil, but just thinking that this is a house of cards that's going to fall really quickly, and I don't want to have to go through a replay of that kind of experience again.
Yeah. There's an interesting scene, or a couple of scenes, with pomegranates in this episode.
Yeah.
And this is significant from Greek mythology, because it's
Persephone
the
and
fruit
Hades.
Hades gives Persephone, and because she's eaten it, she has to stay in the underworld, leading to winter.
Yeah, so that was an interesting thing, because that also makes, for me as an audience member, made me doubt what Ezekiel is and what his intentions are.
Right, it makes you wonder.
Because he keeps stressing that she eat this, and that is kind of a weird thing, since Hades is kind of evil. Although some people kind of go back and forth on this, but the other part of this is that it was a very significant. It was like a significant thing in Egypt, so there was that too. So I didn't know if they were going for that symbol, like as a symbol, or for the Hades scene. The Hades scene seems a little bit more. The Hades myth and the Persephone myth seemed a little bit more on point. But and Carol very kindly just says no.
Although she does go to snag one on her way out of town later on, doesn't she?
She does, but she does it like as a way to, like, I don't know, not it wasn't offered at that point, I suppose. But in any case, it's it's something that they throw into this episode that adds a little bit to the fantastical nature of this. And in Ezekiel himself, as we mentioned, he is this, at face value, seems like this kind of crazy, I don't know what you would even call him, just like a knight king, like a feudal king in the Arthurian legend kind of a way. That's the mythos that he's created around himself. He has a tiger named Shiva.
It was very well CGI
Yep.
built up. I mean, it's hard to tell that
Yeah.
it's not real.
They're like all around the town. There are different sayings by Ezekiel that are put up all around, which actually seem pretty benevolent. You take from the well, you give to the well. There's another one on the wall. Did you happen to catch all those, Stuart?
Not this time around. No.
And one of them
listening.
is related to the dead, and it's like the dead have become alive. Make sure the alive do not become dead, and that kind of thing. So there's all those things that are kind of showing you what the culture of this particular group is. But there are also hidden things with this group, much like there were in Alexandria, which is that Ezekiel and his men are going out and they are giving tribute to the saviors. There is, there's definitely a piece with Morgan trying to figure out what is happening, how much they know, and what is happening within the community. And he's asked to train one of their would-be knights, I suppose. So there's that stuff happening. And then there's the struggle between Morgan and Carol. And keep in mind, Carol basically was very skeptical of Morgan. She was very angry about Morgan's attempted rehabilitation of the wolf and of his way of thinking and way of life. They were enemies, and now they are not. And or at least they have come to some kind of a truce, basically. And there is a struggle about whether to stay in this community or not, and she's very much like, I'm just going to go away, you can't do anything about it. And then she implies almost that she is a wolf, because she says something to him like, oh, are you going to tie me up like a wolf or the wolf? It won't work. So that's an interesting thing of her turning that upon herself about what she thinks where her place is in this world. So so these are all kind of interesting things that are going on. This is very much a Carol episode, that there is some of Morgan going on here. One of the interesting things that's happening within this community and the tributes that they're giving to the saviors is that they are giving them pigs, but they're having the pigs eat the walkers. So that's kind of interesting. And that's a little bit of a mystery, because Morgan just doesn't understand why they're having them do that, because it doesn't seem like a good idea, really.
Yeah, well, they spread this revelation out over the course of the episode, where they explain it later that they take the pigs really far away to butcher them because the screams apparently are disturbing and summon more undead, which just makes a lot of good sense. But they only explain, like, when there's finally a confrontation with the saviors towards the end of the episode, it becomes much more clear. And it's also clear that there are factions within the kingdom, or at least people who are not super psyched about this deal with the saviors, and they're keeping it a secret, which is interesting. And Ezekiel has an answer for all of this, and honestly, I can't help but be like, yeah, dude, this is the guy. This is where we wish Rick had just fallen into the kingdom instead of Alexandria and wasted all of his time there.
Yeah, and maybe if they had done that, they could have combined manpower and forces and been okay. And so, but yet you still feel, and there is this level of stress that I think is probably what Carol is feeling, which is like, you have these people riding around on horses, pretending to be feudal knights, and even in their interactions with the saviors, they seem to come out on the bottom. And I mean, they just don't, as far as we have seen so far, they do not have the firepower that the saviors have. So that is an issue. And that makes you feel as if they are in much more jeopardy. And I do feel like you don't know how much might be going on. Maybe there are things unseen that we don't know yet. But as far as what I saw and what Carol has seen so far, they are definitely living an existence that is close. it's living on the edge basically. So I don't know why the Saviors wouldn't have just taken over this community at this point. So I guess that remains to be seen.
It seems like the ideal relationship that the Saviors would have with the community, even though they tend to. I mean, when we first meet them, for real, they're always robbing everybody, right? Or they just killed everybody at that library. Also at the end of season 6, but then this is a very different working relationship that we see. It's the lieutenant who is kind of a regular, and whose name I never picked up. Who is like the nicer of the lieutenants, although he's always just like, I don't want to do this. Kill this guy, It's that guy. But so it does seem like it depends which lieutenant you get also, as far as how that relationship is going to work. As long as they get their tithe,
right,
it's going to be okay.
Right, but I guess the Saviors strike me as a group that they don't really have limits to the tithes that they want. You know what I mean? So when you see what the Hilltop community is producing and the things that they are able to give, I just feel like the Saviors are not going to just take 8 pigs or whatever it is that they're asking. And maybe it does get to the point where they're asking for so much that the community won't be able to produce it. But it doesn't seem like they would have been held at bay this long if this community had as many resources as they appear to. So that just, it's not sitting well with me. Or it didn't sit well with me when I watched this. And again, we'll see a lot more as we go down the road with this. But the other part of it is that, look, the Hilltop community, so they have a tiger that's eating God knows how much food a day. And Ezekiel actually talks about this at some point.
Yeah, he says he eats as much as 10 men.
Right. But you also have a bunch of horses. And horses eat massive amounts. They take an enormous amount of upkeep. In addition to what they eat, you have you have to basically care for them in a way that would probably be hard in this world, just because they go lame very easily. You have to make sure they're shoed. They have a lot of health issues if they're not cared for properly. And in this world, resources are so slim that I don't know you'd be able to basically have all these people on horseback all the time. But again, this is just like a minor gripe, and I guess you just kind of have to accept it for this particular world that we're in. But the ending of this episode is much more hopeful, and than the last one, clearly.
Yeah.
And you actually see Carol coming to some kind of an equilibrium, and despite herself kind of buying into Ezekiel's philosophy and trusting him, or at least trusting him a little bit.
On her own terms, anyway.
Right. She's a bit of a gatekeeper, so that's kind of how they set her up. So he basically says, you can stay and go, and she's like, kind of like, what? Are you crazy? And that's kind of what they do. So she sets up house, so she's kind of near Hilltop. And then, Ezekiel shows up with a pomegranate and a tiger, and all's well in the world.
It honestly, we needed this episode, especially after the last 2, even though they weren't consecutive, like, one season after another. So I'm just glad that they introduced these guys. Of course, we'll get to season 8 eventually, but hot dog. So for now, we've got this situation. We had the Negan introduction, and then next week, I couldn't stop Netflix from switching to the next episode. We've got an episode that I kind of really enjoyed.
Yeah, it's a good Daryl one.
It's a good Daryl episode. It's a good Saviors episode.
Yep.
And digging into the way that they run their ship. So that'll be a good one too. And yeah, I guess that's kind of it. I think we're into season 7. I had mixed feelings about this season the first time I watched it, and so far it was a real low and a good high.
Yep.
So it's kind of an interesting way to start it off.
Yep, and I had mixed feelings too. I'm curious to see how I feel watching the remainder of the season, but so far I'm just kind of reliving what I did before. But we'll see if my overall feeling about the season changes as we run through these. So anything else to add before we mosey on?
No, I think the next time we get together, we'll do the next 2, 3 and 4, which will be The Cell and Service. I'm not sure what the well was in the Kingdom episode we just watched, but some of the titles are more
Well,
metaphorical than
you
others.
gotta replenish the well. Well, and then there's also, I mean, well, the whole pomegranate night thing. There's like a lot of like in terms of the symbolism and Carol's well, I guess you got to put it back, that kind of thing. So maybe that's what they're talking about. But
Sure.
I know, it is what it is.
But give us a holler on Twitter at reanimatedpcast, reanimatedpodcast@gmail.com, or online at reanimatedpodcast.com. And join us again next time when we come back for more Walking Dead.
Ciao.
Thanks. Bye.